Hello beautiful people, my name is Vendi and I'm here to bring you the Future Classics book tag. The Future Classics book tag was created by Eric Carl Anderson, and I'll have his version of the video in the description box below. And the idea of it is basically what the title suggests, to predict which books will become classics in the future. I was lucky enough to be tagged by Steve Donahue, whose video I'll also link in the description box below. This tag is really interesting to me because it requires you to think ahead and think about what it is that makes a book become a classic, become something that's part of the literary canon. I have my little The Hobbit notebook where I've written down the questions, so if you see me looking down, it's because I'm reading them off. So question number 1 asks you to pick an established classic that you think will remain relevant in the future. For this one, I have to pick The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. I say this because I think that what makes an established classic relevant now is the same thing that's going to make it relevant in the future, and that is the relatability of the book to its readers. There are some things that it would seem haven't changed since this book's writing. People love an underdog. People love when their underdog protagonist has a noble cause, and they love when that noble cause leads some sort of harm, generally physical, to happen to the antagonist. I think that as a species, we tend to relate to the underdog more so than we do to the person that's like a cut above everyone else and has everything handed to them. Everyone likes to think that they have worked for what they've got and that they would perhaps have more had circumstances been otherwise. And we also like to believe the best of ourselves. So if we can project that onto a protagonist who has that noble cause and is an underdog, that is an instant win right there. Additionally, the catharsis we get secondhand from relating to that protagonist and seeing them crush their enemies is perhaps not healthy, but I think it's a really effective way to get out our negative emotions towards people that we think have wronged us on our journeys. The Count of Monte Cristo definitely has all of that, and despite being an absolute beast of a book, it actually is fairly easy to get through. It really reads like it could be a story written in modern day. There's not very fussy, stuffy writing that many people associate with classics, so I feel like its readability to anyone at any stage of the reading game definitely makes it something that will keep it relevant to readers in the future as well. Also, and this might be a personal thing, but maybe not because the book is super popular still, everything in The Count of Monte Cristo, like all the little plot points, tie together in the end in a very neat, wonderful, concise way. There's no question left unanswered. There's no plot point left adrift in the Mediterranean somewhere. Everything comes to a conclusion. It's a very complete story, and while that might not be the most realistic, it is very satisfying to have finished 800 plus pages of book and get absolutely everything that you wanted out of it. It's just a satisfying story, and I feel like that's part of what makes a classic, is how much people flock to it, how satisfied they are upon completing it. Question number 2 is to tell you guys a recent book that went under the radar, but that I'm confident will become a classic in 50 years' time. I haven't read much in the past years that I think is both under the radar and classic worthy. That's not to say that something being on the radar makes it classic worthy. The two classifications are far from mutually inclusive. There are plenty of books that have a bunch of hype surrounding them in this moment in time, but they don't have that something that makes a book timeless in a way, which I think is an attribute that is shared among all classics. So I'm not sure I have a real answer to this one, so I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna go ahead and say Harry Potter, the entire series. This is very much not a story that's under the radar. If you have not read anything else in the world, chances are you've read or at least heard of Harry Potter in some way, shape, or form. But I would say it is definitely recent. It was written in the past 20 years, the entirety of it. And I would argue that within those 20 years, it's become sort of a children's classic already. So Steve and also Carl brought up points during their videos that academia is what makes a classic, and to some extent I agree with both of them on that. However, I think more than just academia is the willingness of the public to continue consuming a thing. And I think Harry Potter actually has both of those elements. Of course, it's only been 20 years, but I feel like this is going to be a lasting thing, and I feel like it was how do I put this? It was a defining book in the middle grade readership genre, whatever you want to call it. Harry Potter changed the game for how stories are told for children, and I think that that is a classic-worthy trait. So I'm going to count it for this question, mostly because I just wanted to see if I could fit Harry Potter into any one of these questions besides the very last one. Question number 3 is to pick a book that won one of your favorite book prizes recently, but that you think will still be lauded in 50 years' time. I'm going to cheat again. The book that I'm going to choose for this one is one that was nominated for just a whole bunch of prizes, and I'm not sure if it won any, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did, and that is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. A Little Life is a book that I still have not read. However, every single person that has read it has a very, very strong opinion about it. Like, I've met people with stronger opinions on A Little Life than they had during this past presidential election in the United States. People that call this the great gay novel. There are people that call it just 800 pages of tragedy porn. And to their dying breaths, they would argue these stances for this book, which I think is kind of amazing. Any sort of discussion around literature is something that I want to be a part of. And I feel like a whole bunch of people in the future will also want to be a part of this, to have a say or a voice in this argument that's been going on basically since its publication. I think it will definitely still be lauded in 50 years' time just because of how angry and adamant people are to prove their points about things. Also, I've heard it's just really beautifully written. It's a common thread that everyone just says it's a pretty book to read. While not necessary to become a classic, it's definitely a helpful thing to have. I don't think people would still be reading like Huck Finn, for example, if it read like that one terrible fan fiction, I think, My Immortal by Ebony, Dementia, Darkness, Raven Way. People like the aesthetics of things, especially in their art, and literature is an art. Beautiful writing is definitely something that helps a book stay on the radar and stay loved. Question number 4 is to pick a recent book that you haven't yet read, but that you think will become a classic in the future, based on its reputation alone. So I suppose my answer, number 3, also could have gone for this one. But I have a very specific thing that I want to say for question number 4. The concept of young adulthood and teenagerhood is relatively new, so a genre that focuses on that concept is also a really, really new thing. YA is still very much in its developmental years, I think, as a genre. It hasn't had a chance yet to claw its way into academia, but I think it will. And one of the books that I think will claw its way sooner than some other books is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. So this is a book that has come out very recently and that I'm actually ashamed to not have read yet, because I believe that it will one day become part of the literary canon that young people, a little younger than myself, are introduced to. The Hate You Give stayed on the New York Times young adult hardcover bestseller list for over a year. Its lasting impact on my generation and the generation, I suppose, before me, pardon me, after me, the people just a little younger, it can't be overstated. It's keeping kids reading, and I feel like teachers and professors are going to notice that, and they're going to adopt it, because whatever's keeping kids literate is a good thing. I think that a solid year of flip-flopping between spots number 1, 2, and 3 on the New York Times list proves that it's not just hype that's driving this book, but a sense in its readership that it's a story worth telling and worth hearing over and over and over again. I think The Hate You Give's greatest strength is that it is a very accurate portrait of the time that we are currently living in. The Black Lives Matter movement is basically the defining moment of the past, I think, decade. We have seen proof that timely stories do well. We still read To Kill a Mockingbird in school. The Great Gatsby is a book that hasn't really gone out of popularity since it was written. Huckleberry Finn, though it's contested in certain schools because of its use of the N-word and other such things, is just as strongly fought for because of the blatant racism in it, because we have to remember that. That's one of those defining moments of the time period of its inception. Basically, it's a portrait of modern day, and I think in 50 years' time, that is a portrait that people will want to look back on, because there are things that we shouldn't forget happen. We can't let history erase its atrocities. And I feel like literature, especially, is almost required to commemorate those things so that we do not forget. And the last question, question number 5, is pick a favorite book that you want to save for your grandchildren or your friends' grandchildren in 50 years' time. I like this question for 2 reasons. Number 1, it doesn't assume that you're going to have grandchildren, because not everyone wants to have grandchildren, and that's completely fine. And 2, it's very much I like this book, so I'm gonna choose it kind of question. I don't have to think deeply as to why I'm including it on this list, which is, I think, a thing that the rest of the questions sort of force you to do. So based on sentiment alone, my top 3 are my copy of Peter Pan, or copies, my copies of The Little Prince, and these 2 are just because they're my favorite books of all time, and then all of my fairy tales, because because those are the stories that I grew up on and that made me believe that magic was possible, and I think that's a really important thing to grow up with. If my future grandchildren don't like any of those books, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to save all my books for them because whatever keeps them reading is something that's going to make me happy, because then we'll have something to connect over when I'm old and gray. Thank you so much again to Steve Donahue for tagging me in this wonderful video. It really made me think, and I had a lot of fun picking my answers and filming it. And now is the time when I pick some of you beautiful people to do it as well. I would like to tag 6 of you lovelies: Bookish Branches, Books Are a Way of Life, Page Turns, The Bald Book Geek, Book Your Imagination, and Random Girl Reading. I'm very excited to see all your videos, and definitely let me know down below if and when you film them, because I'm super excited to hear the things that you guys choose. If I didn't tag you and you'd like to do it, please do, and let me know in the comments below, because this is a really fun tag for me to watch. It was also a really fun tag for me to film, and if you liked it as much as I did, please leave me a thumbs up, and if you like me, maybe consider subscribing. But until then, that's it for me, guys, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!